rifles, grenades, explosive devices, armed drones and RPGs. Even as we speak, all of Gaza is under an information blockout. Gaza Health Ministry also says that electricity has been cut off so that movement of people has become impossible. Meanwhile, Israel says that they have discovered a laboratory which was being used by Hamas for the production of weapons. Since then, that laboratory has also been blown up. Currently, Israeli troops and tanks have encircled Gaza City. The IDF says they will be entering the city in the next 48 hours. The city has been divided into north and southern parts. The troops have warned Gazans to flee to the south as Israeli strikes in northern Gaza have become heavy and sustained over the last 48 hours. In fact, a 4-hour humanitarian pause has also been given. The IDF has eliminated 130-plus Hamas terrorists in just the last 24 hours in Gaza City and has cut off military supply lines of the Hamas inside Gaza. But there are many different facets to this ongoing conflict. As Israel is tightening the noose around Hamas, the terror group has been waging war. What do we make of the last 1 month and what lies ahead? Joining us now is somebody who has spoken out at length about not just Hamas, but Islamist terror as a whole. Dr. Kanta Ahmed, thanks very much for joining us here on Times Now. You've been fighting and speaking out against radical Islam for over 2 decades now. What do you make of the Hamas and, more importantly, of the links you say Hamas shares with other organizations like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban?
Yes, sadly, just as a Muslim woman, I witnessed September 11th from Saudi Arabia. That was my introduction to radical Islam. I'm a physician, and so my life is dedicated to alleviating human suffering. But I found it intolerable that an ideology such as Al-Qaeda had come out of my religion or my fellow co-religionists. And that is what began my odyssey to try and understand this monster and combat it at every opportunity. Certainly, I visited children that were inducted into the Taliban when they were being de-radicalized in northwestern Pakistan. I visited Iraq after the war against ISIS and saw the victims of the ISIS genocide on the Yazidi people and the Kurdish people. When the news broke of what Hamas had perpetrated on October 7th in Israel, which I am classifying as a genocide, I decided to get on a plane and go and see for myself, to bear witness as a human being that atrocities had occurred. The question of the timing, and we can talk about the atrocities, but the timing, almost certainly, this attack was prepared for months, if not over a year. The level of strategic precision, the level of premeditation, the preparation in terms of the arms, the numbers of terrorists that came over the Gaza border, some have said approaching 2,000, almost as big as a military division. That was also supported by civilians that came from Gaza. They came with tablets that had maps, names of families, complete layouts, blueprints of kibbutz communities, mashab communities, and high-value family names who may have been elite commanders or military veterans of high value. And so this was something that was planned for a very long time. In my mind, I also wonder, but I have no proof, that the pivotal conversation between the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Fox News' Brett Baier had happened a few days earlier and had actually disclosed to the world that Saudi Arabia and Israel were moving closer towards peace. And I wondered if that was a catalyst. It may not have been, but that may have been an additional gift to Hamas to inflict greater pain. What I'd like India to know is that this was not just a terrorist attack. I know India has been subject to many Islamist jihadist attacks. The most memorable and most devastating was, of course, the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. I remember watching that live from the United States. But this was much more than a terror attack. The barbarity of this attack I personally witnessed. So the level of hatred, terrorism, barbarity was transgenerational. What do I mean by that? It means that the Hamas killed men, women, children, infants. Even the unborn were murdered by Hamas. They aimed and targeted at eliminating Jewish people. And they did that in their homes, completely unsuspecting and brutally so. So many of the bodies that I examined in the morgue with the pathologists and the forensic anthropologists had been murdered multiple times. That means one body had been shot and stabbed. These bodies were still restrained with the zip ties on their wrists. Some of them were restrained by electrical cord from domestic appliances. And when I looked at the remains of those human beings that were murdered beyond recognition without DNA remaining, they had been incinerated to temperatures of over 700 Celsius. Some feel possibly 3,000 Celsius, which is the temperature at which weapons, grenades, and other explosives and accelerants burn. And so you're left only with the crystals of a spinal column, the crystals of teeth, and it's a very difficult task to identify who these people were. I want India to understand the level of atrocity is probably unlike anything we have seen. I was very familiar with the genocide of the Yazidis by ISIS, and I understand they were also immolated, they were also murdered, their unborn children were also murdered. But this is orders of magnitude more intense, and India should know it was live streamed. People were murdered, and on their social media, their murders were broadcast in real time. Israel, the Israeli military and the Israeli government has terabytes of video recording of Hamas perpetrating those atrocities. So I would like India to lend support to help this atrocity become classified as a genocide, because that has legal implications.
Now, Dr. Ahmed, you've also mentioned that Israel war will be unlike any other conflict that we have seen before. Could you please share why you feel this?
I think that the world that we had before October 7th has changed. This is not just a conventional 20th century conflict between Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Hezbollah. Remember, this is not a war of Israel and the Palestinians. This is a war of Israel and Hamas. But Hamas has, in fact, thrown away all remnants, any relation to humanity in how it has perpetrated these atrocities on Israeli soil, on Jewish people who are the survivors and descendants of those who escaped the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the greatest crime against humanity. And God forbid, nothing ever approach that scale of millions of lives lost for years. And so, number one, committing a genocide of Jewish people in the state of Israel, which has sovereign statehood, rightful membership of the international community, and has been a very important player in the region for India and the United States, and also recently the Arab countries. This also is a war that is proxy and supported by Iran, that finances Hamas. It is also, I am told, receiving financial support from China. China is financing and providing support to Iran, and China is providing means for greater weaponry to be in the hands of Hamas. Now, Israel is in a geopolitically very critical area. It is in the Arab Gulf area, in the Persian Gulf area. It's very important that peace remain intact. And Israel was on the threshold, as was Saudi Arabia, of further solidifying the Abraham Accords. We can see that this is, and I want to talk about the Accords and India, we can see this is already a different conflict, because the United States has sent multiple carrier ships to the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia is now subject to overhead missiles coming from the Houthis, another proxy of Iran in Yemen. Those missiles long-range ballistic missiles are intruding on Saudi Arabian airspace. So Saudi Arabia is intercepting them. That's benefiting Saudi Arabia, and it's also sheltering Israel. So this is already engaging in the region. And you mentioned Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is tightening up the tensions. Hezbollah is the major Iranian proxy, much more heavily armed than Hamas. It has hundreds of thousands of missiles. To understand the power of Hezbollah, the missile bombardment we saw of Russia on Ukraine is the same capability that Hezbollah could have on Israel, God forbid. And so at the moment, Hezbollah has made a lot of saber rattling, but it has not become involved in the war, though there's many skirmishes on the northern border of Israel, which is very well defended. But if Hezbollah becomes involved, this will completely escalate into a multi-regional conflict, not only a Gulf region conflict. Now, if I can just say, because I think this is very important for India's viewers, and India is now the world's most populous nation. It is also the world's most populous democracy, and it is also the fastest growing economy, I think, on the planet, if I'm correct. There was a remarkable initiative which came from Middle East Institute scholar, I think Mohammed Soleimani, if I'm saying his name correctly, and it was endorsed by leading foreign policy thinkers in India, which led to the I2U2 agreement, which is India, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates. I think that came to fruition in 2021, if I'm correct. And that forms tremendous alliances between the UAE and India for food security, climate, energy, digital collaboration, nanotechnology. India has also made her position very clear. India has voted against UN resolutions demanding Israel pursue a ceasefire. A ceasefire is an unacceptable option at the moment, as if you asked the United States for a ceasefire the day after September 11th, or you asked the world for a ceasefire the day after ISIS invaded Iraq and Syria. So India is already supporting Israel, and India is also home to 200 million Sunni Muslims. Hamas is a Sunni Islamist group. This is not to dehumanize or impugn all of India's Muslims. I'm a Muslim originally from India by heritage. But the risks for not eliminating Hamas are so enormous that the world needs to get involved, and Israel needs India's support, not only in the United Nations, potentially in life after the conflict, rebuilding and securing a new Gaza. And I think that will happen from Gulf dollars, Gulf involvement, and potentially the I2U2 agreement. Mm-hmm. Some brilliant minds in India are already thinking 3 steps ahead. And I think it's wonderful. I was present in the White House when the Abraham Accords were signed. I witnessed that myself. And there is a vision in India that India become an additional member of the Abraham Accords and also engage Egypt. And I think that is the future. So this conflict, it's singular in its atrocity, barbarity, premeditation, dehumanization, and eliminationist anti-Semitic intent, but it also motivates the world to engage in a way that was different from the day before the attacks. And I think India has a huge role in realizing that and securing regional peace.
You know, you visited Israel multiple times. It's a very complicated situation. On the one hand, there is the loss of lives in Gaza, the complicated history the two sides share. How do your views inform the current situation in Gaza and in Israel and the conflict that has carried on for over a month now?
So there's no question the fate of the people in Gaza is extremely tragic. Remember, there is not an Israeli occupation of Gaza. Gaza has been governed by Hamas since 2006 or 2007. Gaza had elections, Hamas was elected, and then Hamas immediately executed all of the opposition parties in brutal ways, both by shooting them and also throwing them off buildings. So it was very clear, like all Islamist powers, They use elections once, democracy is a one-way train, and they install themselves forever. A good example is Iran, which is an Islamist pseudo-democracy, and another example is Turkey, where Erdogan has cemented his power for decades. So Hamas has functioned as an Islamist theocracy, Islamist pseudo-democracy in Gaza since it arrived. But also, Hamas has hoarded or accumulated all of the international aid that arrives in Gaza by the hundreds of millions of dollars that were intended for medicines, for schools, for hospitals, for children's care, for surgeries. All of that money has been co-opted by Hamas, so that at the moment, as this war is raging, Hamas operatives, commandos, and military minds, if they're not sitting in their expensive suits in Doha, Qatar, they're actually holed up in the subterranean tunnels, often underneath medical installations, underneath hospitals, with months of fuel, food, and supply, while their civilian population is exposed to the perils of war. I want India to think about one contrast. I grew up in post-World War II Britain. Britain was one of the most, if not the most, bombed nation from the Nazis. And each time the Nazi bombings would come, people would take shelter in the British underground, and the civilians would be somewhat safer, and many would survive. With Hamas and in Gaza, it's the inverse. When the IDF is bombing to eliminate their subterranean access, to eliminate Hamas infrastructure, to eliminate Hamas commandos and Hamas infantry, which are in the order of tens of thousands, Hamas does not allow the civilians to go into the subterranean tunnels. They reserve it for their military infrastructure and for their terrorist infrastructure. That is the contrast. And now we have a population that is captive to Hamas, that is also subject to blockade, which Israel and Egypt have maintained, though, to be completely honest, Israel had been increasing engagement of the Gaza population into Israel proper for many years and had increased the number of Gazans that entered Israel for jobs, for work, for labor. Immediately before the attacks, Israel had increased that to a passage of 20,000 Gazans a day. And now that is how Gaza exploited and achieved terror. That was one of the mechanisms.
But Dr. Ahmed, I also want to ask you about the bombing of refugee camps. You know, on Sunday as well, there were reports saying that the Israeli bombing of the Maghazi refugee camp has killed 47 people. What can possibly be a rationale for that?
There's no question that waging war is a tragedy on both sides. There is no question that there are many civilian Palestinian deaths. And this, of course, I hold responsible, not the IDF. I hold Hamas responsible, whose entire philosophy is to utilize civilians as part of their warfare. People use this phrase, human shield, all of the time in terms of Hamas, and it is true. They use their civilian population as a human shield. They leave them above the surface while they seek cover in subterranean labyrinth of their terrorism tunnels. But they're also using the devastating loss of civilian life, which occurs in any major conflict, to influence international opinion, to portray itself as some kind of liberator or some kind of moral organism, when Hamas is the very opposite. The Hamas leadership is itself genocidal, and Hamas is the genocidaire of the Palestinians. We are almost 1 month out from the atrocities of October 7th, so that is going to go down in history as an unforgettable day in Jewish history for generations to come. And Israel has been begging civilian populations to move, to relocate, to be sheltered. The entire Arab world is witnessing this and has refused. King Jordan very early on said there would be no de facto changes on the ground in the face of this conflict. Egypt has not as yet opened the Rafah border significantly, except for international residents and people that are wounded, and is now there is a field hospital being set up with Egyptian cooperation. But the entire Muslim Arab world is witnessing this atrocity, criticizing Israel, while not lifting a finger. If we can contrast this to the conflict in Ukraine, the day the Russian assault on the Ukraine began, entire continent of Europe opened up its homes and borders to Ukrainians. We're not seeing a similar response in the Arab world, and that's probably multifactorial. Egypt, for instance, is a very depressed economy at the moment. It's very reliant on IMF loans. Its currency has been devalued several times. It has a massive impoverished population of its own. So it's very difficult to accommodate 2 million refugees. That's one hesitation. The other hesitation is Egypt knows how radicalized much of the Gazan population is. Similarly, Saudi Arabia, that has massive land assets, financial resources, not only is not making overtures to receive displaced Palestinians, but also did not receive displaced Syrians, and also has not made accommodations for the people of Yemen, where more than 450,000 lives have been lost. And so the world likes to castigate Israel as the only progenitor of this civilian loss, but that's absolutely not the truth. And let's think about it from Israel's side, or let's think about it from the Indian perspective. Imagine, God forbid, an atrocity like this perpetrated on Indian soil. Would India be able to hold back from a military response? The answer is no. In fact, when genocide has been committed, as I believe this October 7th was genocide, it means that a state actor, a sovereign nation, has legal responsibility to prevent further genocide from occurring on its population. And so Israel is in no other position except to now seek the extinction of Hamas. This is not going to be degradation. This is not going to be temporary neutralization. This is going to be the extinction of Hamas. And the stakes are very high. India has a long experience of the consequences of empowered jihadists in disputed territories, in tensions with Pakistan, for instance. Pakistan itself has had wars with jihadists on its own soil. So the region of India knows very well the consequences. But if for some reason Israel and the United States, Britain, the West is not able to totally defeat Hamas, this will empower every other regional jihadist group, not only in the Gulf area and in your part of the world, but much more widespread. And so the stakes are extremely high for this conflict. Additionally, this is why Hezbollah is still on the sidelines, because there has been a monumental response already in support of Israel. And that is an important deterrent, not only to Hezbollah, but to Iran proper.
Stakes are definitely high, but even the tempers are running extremely high at this point, with many asking if at this point Israel stands guilty of committing war crimes. And that's what we'll talk about at 8:30 p.m. today on India Upfront. For the time being, Dr. Ahmed was speaking to us. Thanks very much.